Today we're making biscuits and gravy. We start by washing our hands, which I've already done. According to the recipe, we'll be using 1 3/4 cups of all-purpose flour, 1 cup Now, all-purpose flour is a general-purpose flour. You use it for all sorts of things. If you ever have a recipe that uses a special kind of flour, you can usually get away with using all-purpose flour. If the recipe says bread flour or pastry flour, it's not optimal, but you can get away with using all-purpose flour. Notice I fill up my measuring cup and then I scrape it off with my knife or straight edge spatula. Now some of you will be confused because it says 1 3/4 cups of flour. And you do not have a 3/4 measuring cup. So we're going to use 1/4 cup 3 times. 1/4 times 3 is 3/4. Again, fill it up. Use my knife, scrape it off. This is 1/4. 2/4, which is a half. Now flour, 2/4, measures differently according to how you use it. And if I just scoop it like this and measure it that way, I get a different measurement than if I actually fill it and scrape it off. Notice also I'm using a dry measuring cup, not a liquid measuring cup. I'm going to set my flour aside, but I will end up using it later on. Now I'm going to have 1/4 cup of whole wheat flour. And I'm going to measure it the same way, fill it up. And scrape it off. Whole wheat flour is going to give it a little bit of a nutty taste, but it's also going to make it more healthy. But not too much. That's why we only used 1/4 cup. To that, we're going to put a 1/2 teaspoon of salt. Notice I'm using a large can of salt. I'm not emptying out my salt shaker to pour salt in here. That's just not very wise use of salt. We've spent time filling that up. We don't want to empty it so quickly. Also notice I don't fill up over my bowl because if I spill, it ruins my measurements. I fill up over the side. So here's a 1/2 teaspoon of salt. And that goes in there. To that, I'm going to add 3/4 teaspoon of baking soda. 3/4. So again, there's no 3/4 teaspoon measuring spoon, but I'm smart, and I'm going to use 1/4 teaspoon, 1, 2, 3 times. That's 3/4 of a teaspoon of baking. Oops, I made a mistake. We actually need a full teaspoon of baking powder. This is baking powder. Some of you probably caught that. So 4/4 is a whole. What I need 3/4 teaspoon of is baking soda. I got them mixed up, so make sure you read your recipes carefully. So baking soda is 1, 2, 3/4 teaspoons. And I need a tablespoon of sugar, which I don't have out. Remember, a tablespoon is the big measuring spoon. Tablespoon of sugar. And a 1/2 cup of butter. Now, a half a cup of butter. We're going to use margarine because it's cheaper. Margarine is artificial butter. This costs $1 a pound, or butter costs more like $4 a pound. And a half a cup is one whole stick. They will be pre-measured for you for use in the classroom, but if you make this at home, just remember a half a cup is a stick. I'm just mixing together my dry ingredients with a pastry blender. It says on the side, 1/4 cup equals 4 tablespoons, third cup equals 5 1/3 tablespoons, and a half a cup equals 8 tablespoons. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, which is an entire stick. Now we're going to do a process called cutting in, where we take our fat, which in this case is margarine, and break it up into little tiny chunks into our dry ingredients. Sometimes it gets stuck like this. So we stand by with our straight edge spatula or a knife to scrape it clean. And all we're doing is breaking up the fat, which in this case is margarine, into tiny little chunks. But again, we have to stop periodically to clean our pastry blender. Now, if you don't have a pastry blender, like you're making this at home and you don't have a pastry blender, you feel free to use a fork. You can do the same thing with a fork. It just takes a little longer, but you can do the same thing. Now you're going to do this until it's crumbly. So in other words, all these little tiny chunks of margarine are very small, pea size or smaller. And okay, it's crumbly. Now the next step is very important. Put away pastry blender. We're not going to use it anymore. Pastry blenders are not to be used for wet ingredients. They're only to be used with your fat and your dry ingredients. So I'm going to put this away. Not to be used anymore for this recipe. Now, the next thing we're going to do is add 2/3 cup of buttermilk. I'm going to use my liquid measuring cup here. Some buttermilk. And measure 2/3 cups. I don't like to use that. It makes a funny noise. I'm going to use a fork instead to get started with, but pretty soon here I'm going to get my hands dirty. So I just want everything to get good and wet. Now, flour contains a protein called gluten. I'm sure you guys have heard of it. When you go to restaurants, they say gluten-free, or you go to stores, they talk about gluten. Gluten is the protein portion of wheat flour. Now, gluten is developed by kneading, but only when it's wet. So once I add the buttermilk, I don't want to overmix it because gluten will cause our baked product to be tough. And we want our biscuits light and fluffy. Okay, it says on the recipe, add enough milk to form a ball. Well, I didn't follow directions very well because I just dumped the whole 2/3 cup in. And actually, I should have put half of it in, mixed it a little bit, but actually I need a little bit more. That's why the recipe says enough to form a ball. So we got some dry areas here. Just a little more buttermilk so the whole mess can be rolled into a ball. Now, before I get my hands dirty, I'm going to put some flour on my hands so that it doesn't stick. And now, I'm going to try and form this into a ball. Again, trying not to be too aggressive with my mixing, because it will develop gluten if I do that. Maybe just a little bit more buttermilk. Okay, the recipe says to add enough milk to form to a ball, knead 3 or 4 times, and here's how we knead. Oops. Fold it in half, squish. Turn it, fold it in half, squish. Turn it, fold it in half, squish. It's starting to stick to my hands, so I get a little more flour. Fold it in half, squish. Then the recipe says to flatten. Okay. Now you can see I have biscuits stuck to my hands. But if you get a partner to sprinkle flour over your hands while you roll them together, then it makes it not stick so much, or makes it easier to clean your hands. Plus you can reuse that biscuit dough. A little bit more flour, please. And there you see it's coming clean off. It's good to have a friend to help you, because you don't want to stick your doughy hands into the clean flour, because that's cross-contaminating, at least in this case. And you can take that, stick it in your dough ball. Okay, from here, we're going to fold and flatten 2 times, and we're going to cut into desired shapes. This tool is a pastry knife, and I'm going to use it to cut my biscuits into desired shape. You can use a rolling pin if you like to flatten out, if you don't mind cleaning another tool. And we'll just get a little bit more flour here on our biscuits. And I can roll them out. You don't want to have dirty rolling pins, because once it starts to stick, it makes a big mess. A little bit more flour there. Okay, you want uniform thickness, about 1/2 inch thick. Now, you can use a round cookie cutter and make round biscuits, or I like to make square biscuits. So I take my pastry knife and make some squares. You can make big ones or little ones, although uniformity is preferred, because we want them all to cook about the same. From here, we're going to place these on a baking sheet. You can cover your baking sheets with flour or parchment paper. And I don't think I have any parchment paper ready here at home. So I'm going to go ahead and use foil. But at school, I will have parchment paper available for you. The idea is we cover the baking sheet, then we don't have to wash the baking sheet. And guess what I forgot to do? Our pre-step, which is preheat the oven. So I'm going to go over here, and now I'm going to preheat the oven. Because I'm doing this at home, check and make sure there's nothing in there. Because I'm doing this at home, I have the luxury of preheating now. But in the classroom, when our time is strictly on a budget, we want to make sure we have our our oven preheated as soon as we walk in, so that when these go in the oven, when they're ready to go in the oven, that they start baking right away. Takes about 15 to 20 minutes to get the oven up to temperature. So I may have to interrupt this video. We'll set those aside for now while the oven is preheating.